I wasn't supposed to hear it. If I had taken the elevator instead of the stairs. If I had gone to bed when Aldous told me he was stepping out to speak with his father. If I had not forgotten my phone on the kitchen counter and come back for it barefoot, moving quietly the way you move through a house at midnight when you think everyone is already done with the day. But I did come back. And the door to Ricky Siegel's private study was not fully closed. I stood in the hallway of the Siegel estate, a hallway I had walked 100 times, a house I had learned to move through like it was my own, and I listened to my father-in-law speak my name with the casual precision of a man giving instructions to be executed. Irma's the exposure point. She's connected to the accounts. When the time comes, she carries it. His voice was not raised. It was never raised. Ricky Siegel was not a man who needed volume to be understood. He had the kind of authority that lived in the steady, unhurried delivery of someone who had never once doubted that his instructions would be followed. She carries it. 2 words. Clean and surgical. Carries what exactly? I pressed my back against the wall and stopped breathing. Because what I heard next was not a business discussion, not a family argument, not even the corporate maneuvering I had spent 5 years learning to anticipate. What I heard next was the word federal. I heard the word liability. I heard the name of an account I had co-signed 18 months ago because Ricky had told me it was a routine company formality. And I heard the specific, careful architecture of a plan that had my name at the center of it, my signature on its most important documents, my professional history woven through it like thread, not because I had built it, but because I had been positioned inside it deliberately over years to be the person left holding it when everything came apart. I had not built a life inside this family. I had been constructed into a contingency. That was when I stopped being afraid and started being precise. My name is Irma Marley. I was raised to work for everything. I had never in my life been given anything I didn't earn, and I had spent 5 years earning a place inside a family that had already decided what to do with me when I was no longer convenient. They thought I was asleep. They thought I had no idea. They thought that by the time the story got to its ending, I would be standing in a federal office somewhere trying to explain documents I had signed in good faith while Ricky Siegel walked away untouched. They were wrong. By sunrise, I wasn't the woman they had planned around anymore. I was the woman who had already moved. Subscribe right now. Because what Irma does in the next 8 hours is going to make you put your phone down and stare at the wall for 5 minutes. This is not a story about a woman who survived. It's a story about a woman who outmaneuvered a mafia operation before breakfast. You need to be here for all of it. To understand what I did that night, you need to understand how I got into that hallway in the first place. Not just the marriage, not just the family, the years. The slow, methodical accumulation of decisions I made in good faith that had been quietly redirected into something I would never have agreed to if anyone had shown me the full picture. I grew up in Decatur, Georgia, the second of 3 children raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital and a father who ran a small accounting firm out of a converted garage. Neither of them had money. Both of them had precision. My father used to say that numbers don't lie, but people who hold them do, and I grew up treating that as something close to scripture. I studied finance at Spelman, worked 3 jobs through my master's program, and came out the other side with the kind of methodical patience that made me very good at understanding structures other people considered too complex to bother with. I could sit with a 70-page document and find the paragraph on page 43 that changed the meaning of everything that came before it. I could track money through 7 entities and tell you where it started, where it stopped, and what it picked up along the way. I met Aldous Siegel at a conference in Chicago when I was 29. He was charming in the way of men who have grown up watching charm work and learned to deploy it without effort. He was also, underneath the charm, genuinely curious about how I thought. He asked real questions. He listened to the answers. He didn't take up all the oxygen in a room, which in my experience was rare in men with money and rarer still in men with powerful fathers. We were married 2 years later. I knew what the Siegel family was in the general sense that most people who move in certain Atlanta circles know old money with a complicated history, real estate holdings that extended further than the public records suggested. A patriarch who had been navigating the distance between legitimate business and other arrangements for long enough that the distance had become invisible to most people who looked at him. I told myself it was not my concern. I told myself I was marrying Aldous, not the family. This is the thing about stories like mine. The moment you can point to where you made the wrong assumption is never dramatic. It's a Tuesday. It's a sentence you let pass without asking the follow-up question. It's a document you sign because someone you love assures you it's routine, and you trust them, and routine is a word designed to make the unexamined feel safe. I had 5 years of routine. 5 years of building, contributing, earning. 5 years of becoming indispensable to an operation I did not fully understand until the night I stood in a hallway and heard my name spoken as a solution to a problem. This is where the story actually begins. It was a Thursday in late November, and we had been at the Siegel estate for dinner. This was not unusual. Ricky maintained what he called a standing family tradition, dinner on the last Thursday of the month at the main house in Buckhead, a property that sat behind iron gates and a quarter-mile of managed landscaping and communicated its own significance before you reached the front door. The house was large enough to contain entire conversations in its walls without the people inside them knowing. I had eaten at that dining table more times than I could count, passed dishes and discussed projects and smiled at the right moments through more exchanges than I had ever fully parsed. Aldous and I had our own wing when we stayed over, which we did on Thursdays when dinner ran late and Ricky produced the good bourbon, and the conversation extended into territory that made driving home feel irresponsible. That night I had gone to our room at 11. Aldous had stayed downstairs with his father and a man named Fenwick Bard, who was described as a financial consultant and who had the specific, unreadable quality of a person whose professional title was designed to communicate as little as possible. I had not been able to sleep. This was not new. I had been sleeping badly for 3 weeks, a low-level, persistent unease I couldn't trace to anything specific except a feeling that something in the architecture of my life had shifted in a way I could not yet identify. I had attributed it to stress, to a difficult quarter at the firm, to the normal friction of a marriage that had accumulated its share of silences. I went back downstairs for my phone at 12:17. I know the time because I checked it when I picked the phone up from the counter, a reflex, the kind of thing you do when you've been lying awake in the dark and time has become unmoored. The kitchen was at the end of a long corridor. The study was off that same corridor, its door standing roughly 6 inches open, light pressing through the gap in a thin, warm line. I was 3 feet past the door when I heard my name. I stopped. Not from panic. From the specific, involuntary arrest of a body that has registered something important before the mind has finished processing it. I stood still in the dark hallway and I listened. Ricky's voice was the same at midnight as it was at noon, measured, deliberate, the voice of a man who had learned that quiet authority was more effective than any other kind. Fenwick said something I couldn't hear clearly. Ricky responded, and this time the words were distinct. The accounts she signed for are positioned perfectly. Federal investigators are always looking for the individual, not the structure. If the structure becomes public, Irma's signature is on everything visible. The rest is insulated. Silence. Then Fenwick again, closer to the door this time, his voice carrying better. And if she figures it out before. She won't, Ricky said. She's thorough. That's why we used her. She follows process. She doesn't look behind the process. I want to tell you that I felt rage. I want to tell you the heat of it moved through me and clarified everything instantly. But that isn't what happened. What happened was colder than rage and more useful. What happened was the specific, awful clarity of a person who has just had a long-running question answered, and the answer is worse than any version they had considered. She doesn't look behind the process. I had been chosen because I was trustworthy. My precision, my diligence, my faith in documentation and proper procedure, these had not been assets. They had been the mechanism. I had been useful precisely because I followed the architecture without questioning who designed it or why. I heard one more exchange before I moved. Fenwick asked about the timeline. Ricky said before the end of year. He said my name once more, not with contempt, not with any emotion at all, just with the flat utility of a label, and said that once the federal pressure came to a point, the signature trail would do the work for them. I would be the person who had moved the money. I would be the person with documented access. I would be the person with the explainable motive if anyone looked hard enough at the personal accounts they had helped me open 2 years ago. Accounts I had believed were routine financial planning and which I now understood had been opened to establish a paper history. I had been the backup plan. The clean exit for an operation I had never been invited to understand. I walked back up the corridor. I did not run. I did not turn on any lights. I climbed the stairs to our wing, and I sat at the edge of the bed in the dark with my phone in my hands, and my husband asleep 3 feet away, and I thought with a precision I had never felt before, and have never quite felt since. The anger would come later. The grief about Aldous, the questions about how much he knew and when he knew it and what his silence had made him, all of that would come later. There was no time for it now. What I needed, in the next 6 hours, before any Thursday became a Friday and before Ricky Siegel's timeline had a chance to advance by a single day, was to understand exactly what I had signed, where it was held, and what I could legally, verifiably, documentably move. I opened my laptop. I was not running. I want to be clear about that. I was working. Before I tell you what I did that night, I need to tell you what I had built. Because none of what follows makes sense without understanding what was at stake, and what was at stake was not just money. It was 5 years of my life translated into structure, and structure, as my father used to say, is just power that learned to dress itself in paperwork. When I joined the Siegel Group, first as a financial consultant, then as a full partner in operational oversight, the company was carrying the weight of a patriarch who had made large decisions with other people's money and trusted that his reputation would absorb the consequences. Ricky Siegel was not a bad businessman in the conventional sense. He understood leverage and relationship and the specific currency of being a man other men wanted to stay close to. What he did not understand, or perhaps did not care about, was the day-to-day precision required to sustain growth beyond a certain point. I brought that precision. I restructured 3 development projects in the first year that had been hemorrhaging money through contractor mismanagement and timeline drift. I renegotiated 2 supplier agreements that had been grandfathered in on handshake terms and were quietly costing the company more than anyone had bothered to calculate. I built a reporting system that made the company's actual financial position visible for the first time in its history, which was uncomfortable for approximately 4 weeks and then became the foundation of a credit expansion that funded the company's largest acquisitions. Ricky called me an asset in the first year. In the second year, he stopped acknowledging me directly in meetings with outside partners and started allowing others to speak to my work as though it had emerged organically from the organization rather than from a specific person who had not slept adequately. In 18 months. I noticed this. I filed it. I kept working. What I understood about men like Ricky Siegel was that their trust was not given, it was confirmed gradually through performance, and once you had it, the way to keep it was to stay indispensable without ever becoming threatening. I was careful about this. I was perhaps too careful. In staying non-threatening, I had failed to stay vigilant. The accounts I had co-signed were the sharpest example of this failure. There were 4 of them. The first 2 I understood clearly, operational reserves tied to specific development projects, routine in structure, routine in function. The third I had reviewed briefly and signed because Ricky's attorney, a man named Bram Essel who had worked with the family for 15 years, had presented it as a liquidity buffer for an acquisition that was still in negotiation. The fourth I had barely reviewed at all. It was presented on a day when I was managing 3 competing deadlines, and Aldous had been in the room, and I had signed it in the way you sign something when the people around you whose judgment you have decided to trust are signaling that it's fine. Sitting in the dark with my laptop open, I pulled up every document associated with those 4 accounts. I read them the way I should have read them the first time, not with the good faith of a woman inside a family she believed in, but with the forensic attention of a woman who has just learned she is the designated fall. The first 2 accounts were clean, exactly what they had been presented as. The third account was more complex. The liquidity buffer for the acquisition had been expanded several times since I signed the original document, and the funds flowing through it were not tied to any project I recognized. The signatories had changed. My name was still there at the origin, but subsequent additions had layered on top of it in a way that made me the primary visible authority, while the actual operational control had shifted elsewhere. The fourth account was the one that made me put my hand flat on the desk and breathe. The fourth account was held under a structure that connected to 3 shell entities I had never heard of. My signature appeared on the establishment documents, which meant I had, technically, opened it. The incoming transfers were documented as consulting fees, licensing income, and operational disbursements from sources I could not immediately identify. The amounts were not small. The fourth account was where money that could not be easily explained was being stored under my documented authority. Ricky had not framed me overnight. He had built the frame over 2 years, brick by brick, using my own professional habits as mortar. My diligence, my trust in the process, my unwillingness to question what people I loved had told me was routine, all of it had been the tool. I sat with the full picture for 11 minutes. I allowed myself that. 11 minutes to feel the weight of understanding something you cannot ununderstand and to recognize the specific grief of being deceived by someone you fed, celebrated birthdays beside, called family. Then I closed that part of myself down and opened the part that my father had built when he sat me at his accounting desk at age 12 and told me that every number has a home and every home has a door, and if you hold the key, you hold the outcome. I held some keys. Not all of them, but enough. The question was whether enough was sufficient. I was about to find out. Irma Marley spent 11 minutes grieving. Then she opened a laptop. Subscribe, because what she does between 1 a.m. and sunrise with nothing but access codes and 11 years of financial expertise is about to become your new benchmark for composing. The first thing a person does when they discover they've been positioned as a liability is resist the urge to act immediately. This is counterintuitive. Every instinct says move, disrupt, make noise. But noise is exactly what the people who built this kind of structure are counting on. Noise creates a record of emotional response. Emotional response undermines credibility. Undermined credibility makes the narrative they've already prepared about you easier to sell. I did not make noise. I made a list. By 1 a.m, I had mapped every account to which I had documented access, cross-referenced against every account I had signed for, and separated them into 2 categories. The first category was accounts where my authority was legitimate, current, and untangled from the structures Ricky had built around my name. The second category was the one that mattered, accounts where my signature existed, but where the subsequent architecture had been constructed by hands other than mine, for purposes I had never been told. The fourth account was the nucleus of the problem. But it was not the only problem. There were 2 additional instruments I found as I went deeper into the documentation: a letter of credit I had co-authenticated that had been used as collateral for a transaction I did not recognize, and a series of wire authorizations that bore my electronic signature on timestamps that did not align with any working day I could account for. The electronic signatures. That was the piece that stopped my breathing for a moment. I am meticulous about my credentials. I change passwords on a documented schedule, use 2-factor authentication on everything financial, and never access accounts from unsecured networks. I know this because precision in digital security is as fundamental to financial work as reading the fine print. I had not authenticated those wire transactions, which meant someone had. Bram Essel was the most likely candidate. He had managed document preparation for years and had levels of access that had been granted during a period when the family trusted him with everything. But whether it was Bram or someone else was a question for a different conversation. What mattered in this moment was that my name had been used without my knowledge to authorize movements I could not account for, and those movements were part of a structure designed to point toward me when the investigators came. I needed to do two things simultaneously. I needed to extract myself from the accounts where my authority was being misused, and I needed to document everything I was finding in a way that established my position as a discoverer rather than a participant. The distinction was everything. A participant runs. A discoverer documents and acts within their legal authority. I had legitimate access to the operational reserves that sat inside the two clean accounts. I had built those reserves during the Miami expansion, a liquidity buffer of just under $9 million that I had structured, monitored, and maintained within policy guidelines. Those funds were reachable. Those movements, if executed under my existing authorization, would be entirely defensible. Not a retreat. A secured repositioning. The second thing I needed was a person. Not a lawyer, not yet, because lawyers leave trails and trails create timelines, and I did not want my timeline to begin at 1 a.m. in Ricky Siegel's guest wing. What I needed was someone in private banking who understood that speed and discretion were sometimes the same service. Her name was Novalee Birch. I had worked with her 3 years earlier on a capital restructuring for a hotel acquisition, and what I knew about Novalee was that she operated with the efficiency of someone who had learned that the most important decisions happened outside of business hours, and that the clients who called after midnight were the ones worth keeping. I sent her a message through the encrypted banking platform we had used during the hotel deal. I did not explain the family situation. I said only that I needed to execute a protective restructuring of specific operational reserves under my executive authority, and that I needed it completed before 8 a.m. She responded in 14 minutes. We spoke for 23 minutes. She asked the questions a good banking officer asks: legal authority, documentation, source of funds. I answered every one calmly, with specific reference to dates and authorization records. Nothing I was requesting fell outside my documented rights. Nothing required an exception or a judgment call in my favor. I was operating precisely within the boundaries of what I had been given access to, which was exactly how Ricky Siegel had failed to predict this moment. He had used my name without consulting me. He had not considered that my name came with an actual person who understood what the name had signed. By 3:40 in the morning, the first transfer confirmation appeared in my inbox. By 4:50, the second. By 5:30, the reserves I had built and managed were no longer sitting in accounts connected to Ricky Siegel's financial architecture. They were in a secured holding structure under my maiden name, fully documented, traceable to my original legal authority, and positioned in a place where no vote, no board session, and no retroactive claim of misconduct could reach them without going through a legal process that would require disclosing every document I had just finished photographing. I closed my laptop. Aldous was still asleep. I lay down on my side of the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the morning, which was coming faster than I needed it to, and about the conversation I was going to have with my husband and what his face was going to tell me about how much he had known. I had moved what I could move. Now I needed to understand what had been moved around me. I have never been a good liar. I want to be honest about that. I was raised by people who treated dishonesty as a kind of waste, a choice that required more energy than the truth and produced worse outcomes. What I am instead is disciplined. I can hold information without displaying it. I can be present in a conversation that is performing something different from what it contains. I can sit at a breakfast table with a man who has quietly positioned me as his criminal contingency plan, and ask him to pass the orange juice. This is not the same as lying. It is the same as surviving. Ricky Siegel came down to breakfast at 7:15, which was his routine. He was dressed in his full weekday presentation, dark suit, cufflinks, the physical language of a man who had decided long ago that authority was partly costume. He sat at the head of the table and unfolded the paper with the ease of someone whose morning is proceeding exactly according to his expectations. Aldous came down at 7:30. He kissed me on the cheek the way he always did and poured coffee and made a comment about traffic on Peachtree that had no content but filled the specific silence that mornings in that house sometimes required. I had been awake for 7 hours. I had moved nearly $9 million and documented the discovery of a financial framework built around my identity to absorb federal liability. I ate scrambled eggs and half a piece of toast and kept my expression at the precise calibration of a woman who had slept adequately and had nothing more pressing on her mind than the quarterly projections due next week. Ricky asked about a contractor review. I answered with the level of detail the question deserved, not more, not less. Fenwick Bard was not at the table. I noted his absence the way you note anything that confirms a theory you are in the middle of testing. It was Aldous who gave me the first real information. Not through what he said. Through what he almost said and then didn't. We were discussing a project timeline, and he started to reference an upcoming meeting and then stopped himself. It was a small stop, a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that disappears in ordinary conversation. But I had been watching him the way you watch someone when you are trying to determine the shape of what they know, and I caught it. He knew something. Whether he knew everything was still a question. Whether he had participated or merely been present or had tried to stop it and failed was still a question. But the gap between starting to say something and choosing not to was a data point. I looked at him once, directly, long enough for the look to register. He held my eyes for 2 seconds and then looked at his coffee. Not guilty, exactly. Uncomfortable in the way of someone who is carrying a weight they've decided to carry alone and is not certain they made the right choice. I let it pass. The table was not the place for that conversation. Ricky said something about a board session later in the week and glanced at me with the measured attention of a man checking a gauge. I responded that I would clear my schedule and asked whether it required preparation materials. He said it was routine. I nodded in the way of a woman for whom routine is sufficient information. There is something almost clarifying about performing normalcy when everything underneath it has already changed. The performance requires you to be very precise about what you're communicating and what you're withholding, and precision, in that week of my life, was the only tool I had full confidence in. Fenwick Bard arrived at 9:15. He came through the back entrance, which meant he had a key, which meant his access to the house was not the occasional advisor level I had assumed. He had a leather portfolio under one arm and went directly to Ricky's study without appearing in any of the common spaces. 40 minutes later, I heard Ricky's voice from the hallway. Shorter sentences than usual. A pause where there should not have been a pause. He had checked the accounts. I did not smile. I did not change anything about the way I was sitting at the kitchen counter reviewing reports on my laptop. I turned a page. I made a note. I heard Ricky's door close more firmly than necessary, and I kept my eyes on the document in front of me. The morning, from the outside, looked like any other. Inside the walls of the Siegel estate, something had shifted that could not be unshifted. Ricky knew the reserves had moved. He did not yet know how or by what authority. What I understood that he did not was that the how and the authority were the entire story, and the story was entirely defensible. But I also understood that a man who has built an operation of this complexity does not respond to disruption with patience. He responds with acceleration. I needed to be ahead of that acceleration. Not by a day, by enough. I texted my attorney at 9:50. Not Bram Essel, who was Ricky's attorney and whose loyalty I now understood clearly. My own attorney, A woman named Greta Solis who had handled my personal legal affairs since before the marriage and who charged more per hour than most people made in a day and was worth every cent. I said, "Need to meet today. Urgent. Bring the privileged documentation." She responded in 4 minutes. Noon. My office. Already blocking it. This was why you paid Greta Solis what she charged. Irma ate scrambled eggs while Ricky realized his accounts were empty. Subscribe, because Ricky Siegel is about to make a decision that Irma has already prepared for, and watching a meticulous woman outpace a panicking mafia boss is genuinely one of life's great pleasures. Greta Solis had an office on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown that communicated competence without ostentation. No art that required explanation. No furniture that performed luxury at the expense of function. A desk that held an organized crisis and a woman behind it who had seen enough organized crises to have stopped finding them remarkable. She looked at everything I had brought her over the course of 2 hours. She asked questions the way good attorneys ask them, without leading, without sympathy, without any indication of what she was thinking until she had assembled the complete picture. When she finished, she folded her hands on the desk and said, "You need to understand what the fourth account actually is." I said I had a theory. She said my theory was correct and that it was worse than I had described it to myself. The fourth account, as she explained it after 2 phone calls with a financial crimes specialist she trusted, was a layering vehicle. Money entered it from sources that were, on the surface, legitimate consulting income, licensing fees, management disbursements. What happened to that money as it moved through the account and out the other side was the relevant part. It was being cleaned. The incoming funds had origins that would not withstand federal scrutiny, and the account structure was designed to produce documentation that traced the cleaned version back to legitimate corporate activity. My signature on the establishment documents made me, on paper, the account's originating authority. The electronic signatures on the wire transactions made me, on paper, an active participant in its operation. Neither of those things was true. But paper, as my father had also told me, does not care about your intentions. Paper says what it says. The question, Greta said, is whether you acted or whether you discovered. I discovered. Can you document when you discovered it? The message to Novalee Birch is timestamped. The transfer confirmations are timestamped. Every piece of the restructuring I initiated is documented in sequence, beginning at approximately 1 a.m. on Thursday. And the prior account access? I can pull the login records. I access the first 2 accounts regularly. The third account I access twice. The fourth account I have no login record for beyond the establishment document, which I signed at a meeting I can describe, date, and name witnesses to. Greta made a note. The electronic signatures on the wire transactions, have you looked at the IP addresses on the authentication records? I had not. I said so. She made another note. That is the most important piece. If the authentication came from a device or location that cannot be attributed to you, it becomes extremely difficult to sustain the argument that you were a willing participant rather than a forged one. I thought about Bram Essel and his 15 years of access and his leather portfolio and his key to the back entrance. I have a name, I said. Save it, Greta said. Don't say it to me yet. Say it to me after I've reviewed the authentication records and after you've thought carefully about whether you want to bring it into a legal proceeding or keep it as leverage. She then said something I had not expected. She said that federal investigators had been building a case around a network of shell entities in Atlanta for approximately 18 months, and that one of those entities had appeared in documents she had seen in an adjacent matter 6 months ago, and that the entity name matched one of the 3 structures connected to the fourth account. I looked at her. She looked back at me without any expression I could read. I'm not telling you anything I know definitively, she said. I'm telling you that if you have documentation that connects you to the discovery of this account and demonstrates that you moved funds within your legal authority before taking any further action, there is a version of this story where you are not the target. There is a version where you are the witness. I understood what she was telling me without her having to say it directly. The federal investigation was already in motion. It had been in motion before I ever stood in that hallway. And whatever I did in the next 72 hours would determine whether I entered that investigation as a defendant or as something else entirely. I asked her what she recommended. She said, "I recommend you document everything you have. Give me 48 hours to make 3 phone calls, and in the meantime, continue going to work, continue attending that board session, and give absolutely no indication to anyone in the Siegel family that you have spoken with me." I said I could do that. She said, "One more thing. Your husband." I said nothing. "You need to decide, before the board session, whether you know whose side he's on." I went home. I made dinner. I sat across from Aldous and watched him the way I had learned to watch people who were carrying things they had not chosen to set down yet. He was quieter than usual. He ate without appetite. He looked at me twice with an expression I could not name because it combined too many things, something like regret and something like anticipation and something underneath both of those that I had seen before and not been able to identify until now. It looked like waiting. He was waiting for something. I did not yet know what. The session was scheduled for 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon in the company's main conference room on the 22nd floor. 10 board members. Ricky at the head of the table. Aldous to his left. 3 outside directors who had been brought in during the expansion years and who had the careful neutrality of people trying to read a room before committing to a position. I arrived 8 minutes early, which was exactly what I always did, because in my experience the person who arrives first controls the energy of the room before anyone else has the opportunity to set it. I arranged my documents. I set my phone face down. I placed a glass of water in front of me that I did not intend to drink. Ricky came in at 1:58 and looked at me for a fraction of a second longer than a glance requires. I met his eyes with the specific, pleasant neutrality of a woman who has already played this game to its conclusion and is waiting for everyone else to catch up to where the board stands. The session opened with standard procedural items. A project update. A lender communication. The kind of content that fills the front of a meeting to warm the room before the real business arrives. Then Ricky's attorney, not Bram Essel, who was conspicuously absent, but a man named Caverly who had the tight, prepared look of someone brought in for a specific task, presented a conduct review document citing concerns about financial irregularities in the operational accounts. The irregularities were the transfers I had made 2 nights before. I had expected this. I let him present for 4 minutes without interruption. Then I opened my folder. I walked through the documentation in sequence. My original executive authorization for the operational reserves. The policy guidelines governing their management. The specific clauses establishing my right to restructure them under certain conditions that my own internal risk assessment, dated 3 weeks prior, had formally identified as met. I placed that risk assessment in front of each board member. The outside directors read it. They read it carefully. Then I placed the second set of documents. The authentication records for the wire transactions on the 4th account that bore my electronic signature. The IP addresses, which Greta's financial crime specialist had traced overnight to a device registered in Bram Essel's name, connecting to a server access point in the Siegel estate at times when I had been verified by hotel records to be in Miami for a conference. The room became very quiet. Then I placed the third set. The entity documents for the 3 shell structures connected to the 4th account, cross-referenced against the federal filing database, which showed that 2 of those 3 entities were currently under active investigation by the Department of Justice Financial Crimes Division. Caverly started to speak. One of the outside directors, a woman named Otla Vane who had 15 years on corporate boards, and the unimpressed steadiness of someone who had outlasted more crises than she could name, raised a hand without looking at him. "Mr. Caverly," she said, "I think we need to pause." Ricky's posture had not changed in the way that would have looked obvious. But I had been watching him for 5 years, and I could see the small tells, the way his jaw had reset, the way his hands on the table had stopped being casual and become deliberate. He was not panicking. Men like Ricky Siegel did not panic at tables. But he was recalculating. He looked at me. I looked back. I said nothing. I did not need to. It was Aldous who spoke. He had been silent through the entire first half of the session, and in the silence I had continued to feel the thing I had identified the night before, the waiting, the held quality of a man about to set something down. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at his father and said, "There's something the board needs to know." The room turned toward him. Ricky turned toward him, and for the first time in this entire sequence of events, I saw something in Ricky Siegel's face that I had never seen there before. Something that was almost disbelief. Not anger, disbelief. The specific, structural shock of a man who has been moved against by someone he did not include in his calculation. What Aldous said next took 37 minutes. He had been cooperating with federal investigators for 8 months. He had begun the cooperation after discovering, through a document that crossed his desk by accident, the full architecture of what his father had built around my name. He had not told me because the investigators had required him not to, because the investigation needed to run its course, and because warning me could have altered my behavior in ways that would compromise the case. He had spent 8 months being present in my life, watching me operate in good faith inside a structure designed to destroy me, and being unable to say anything directly. He had told me, he said, in the only way he could. He had been leaving things. Small gaps in information. Subtle hesitations at moments when I might pause and look more closely. The incomplete sentence at breakfast. The documentation he had quietly surfaced through internal systems and then not mentioned to anyone. Documentation that had found its way to me through normal work review processes and that I had incorporated into my own analysis without realizing it had been placed there intentionally. He had not been waiting at that breakfast table because he didn't know what was coming. He had been waiting because he knew what I was capable of, and he had been waiting to see if I would find it myself. I sat at that board table and looked at my husband and thought about all the things I had believed about my marriage and about all the questions I had asked myself in that dark bedroom 2 nights before and about the 11 minutes I had given myself to grieve before I opened my laptop. He knew what I would do. He had trusted that I would do it. And he had been in an impossible position for 8 months, unable to tell me that the thing I had built my professional life inside was a frame, unable to warn me directly, trying to leave me enough of the right pieces so that when the moment came I would be standing on the right side of it. The board session ended 3 hours later with Ricky Siegel escorted from the building by federal agents who had been waiting in the lobby since before the session began. Caverly gathered his documents and left without speaking to anyone. The outside directors asked questions for an hour and then requested a full audit. Aunt Levane told me, as she was leaving, that she had suspected something for 2 quarters and that she was relieved someone had finally made the picture clear. I sat at the table after everyone was gone. Aldous sat beside me. We did not speak for a long time. He had found out by accident. This is how the most important things tend to start, which is one of the lessons this entire experience hammered into me repeatedly, not through dramatic revelation, not through deliberate investigation, but through the ordinary accident of a wrong document in the right place at the wrong time. He had been reviewing acquisition contracts 14 months ago. A document came across his desk that should have gone to Bram Essel's office and instead landed in the pile his assistant had sorted for his signature. It was an authorization letter connecting Aldous's name, not Ricky's, not a shell entity's, but Aldous's personal name, to a set of ongoing transactions that he had never approved and knew nothing about. He had confronted his father. Ricky, to his credit or perhaps to his damage, had not denied it. He had explained, with the same measured efficiency he brought to every conversation, that the business required certain accommodations, that these accommodations had been managed carefully. and that Aldis's role was to continue operating the legitimate side of the enterprise without asking questions that would benefit no one to have answered. Aldis had not agreed. He had sat in that study, the same study where I would later stand in the hallway, and understood that what his father was describing was the end of every version of his life he had planned for. He could continue and become complicit. He could leave and lose everything, including me. Or he could do something that required 8 months of silence and a level of trust in me that, as he told it, had cost him more than anything he'd ever done. He had contacted the federal investigators 6 weeks after that conversation. He had done it through a separate attorney, one Ricky did not know about and would never have expected his son to retain. He had spent the next 8 months as a cooperative witness, giving investigators the structural documentation they needed while remaining in position at the company so that nothing changed before the case was ready. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Though by the time I asked it, I already understood the answer. They told me that if your behavior changed, if you began acting as though you knew something was wrong, it would alert Ricky and potentially alert Bram, and either of them could have accelerated the plan before we had enough to act on. The whole case depended on the frame remaining in place long enough to document the full operation. He looked at me. They needed Ricky to believe everything was proceeding according to his plan right up until the moment it wasn't. And you needed me to keep acting like a woman who didn't know. Yes. Which meant you needed me to actually not know. Yes. I sat with that. The specific, complicated weight of a betrayal that was also a protection. A silence that had been chosen not out of indifference, but out of a calculation that my ignorance was the safest thing for me, the cleanest legal position. The one path through that didn't require me to carry the knowledge of what was coming every day for 8 months while pretending I didn't. He had been right. I knew it even as some part of me resisted knowing it. "The documents you surfaced," I said. "The things that ended up in my review pile." "I couldn't tell you directly," he said. "I could make sure you had access to what you needed. You left me a trail. I left you what I could. I trusted you to follow it." I thought about the night in the hallway. I thought about the fact that my going back for my phone at midnight had not been entirely random. I had been restless for weeks, sleeping badly, with a low-level awareness that something in the structure of my life was not right. I had been responding to information Aldis had quietly surfaced. My own diligence had been pointed, gently, in the direction of the thing I needed to find. Not manipulated. Trusted. There is a difference, though it is a fine one, and I would spend a long time afterward tracing its edges. "The investigators knew I might move the accounts," I said. "They hoped you would. It was the cleanest way to establish your position as someone acting in legal self-defense rather than someone complicit in the operation. When you moved the reserves under your documented authority, you drew a clear line between what you had legitimately built and what Ricky had built around you. That line was important for the case. You couldn't tell me that either." "No." "So you just waited. And hoped I would find the hallway." He looked at me. "I hoped you would be exactly who I knew you were." I looked at him for a long time. At the face of the man I had married and thought I understood, and had spent 2 nights re-examining with the thoroughness of a person who has discovered that the story she knew had a room she hadn't been shown. "We have a great deal to discuss," I said. "I know. Starting with the fact that you kept 8 months of something this size from me. I know. And ending with the question of whether I believe you had no other option." He nodded. He didn't argue. He let it sit the way he had learned, in 8 months of impossible silence, to let difficult things sit. "Do you," he said finally, "believe it?" I thought about my father at his accounting desk. About numbers and homes and keys and outcomes. About the $9 million I had moved in the dark and the documents I had laid on that board table, and the way Aunt Levane had looked at me as she left like a woman recognizing something she'd been waiting to see. "Ask me again in 6 months," I said. Ricky Siegel was indicted on 11 counts. Bram Essel cooperated with federal prosecutors and received a reduced charge in exchange for his full testimony. Fenwick Bard disappeared from Atlanta so quickly and so completely that his disappearance itself became a subject of federal interest, though that is a thread of the story I have never fully pulled. The company did not collapse, which surprised people who had been watching from outside and expected the indictment of its patriarch to bring the structure down with him. What they hadn't accounted for was that the legitimate side of the enterprise, the development projects, the property holdings, the operational architecture that I had built and Aldous had maintained, was genuinely clean. It had been built by people who did not know, or had refused to know, or in Aldous's case had known and acted to stop it. Once the contaminated portions were separated out through the federal process and the board was restructured under Ott Levain's interim leadership, what remained was a company that was smaller and more honest than it had been before. I was offered the executive directorship. I took 3 weeks before I answered. Not because I was uncertain about the work, I was not. The work I understood completely and could direct clearly and had in some ways been directing for years without the title to match it. What I needed 3 weeks to answer was the larger question of what I was building my life around and whether the building I had been inside for 5 years was one I wanted to continue occupying. I said yes. Not because it was the obvious next step. Because I had spent 5 years constructing something real inside a container that had been corrupted, and the real thing deserved to survive the container it had been built in. Aldous and I spent 6 months in the kind of conversation you have when the person across from you has turned out to be more complicated than you understood, and you have to decide whether complicated is what you are willing to love. It was not an easy 6 months. There were nights when I lay awake cataloging what he had withheld and understanding each decision intellectually without being able to feel past it emotionally. There were mornings when I looked at him and saw the man I had married and the 8 months he had carried alone and found both things simultaneously true and both things requiring more from me than I was certain I had. He gave me time. He did not ask me to process faster than I could process. He did not offer justifications repeatedly or build a case for himself. He simply continued being present in the way that had, I now understood, always been his primary language, not declarative, not performative, but consistent. Study in the way that outlasts speeches. At 6 months and 11 days, sitting in the kitchen of the apartment we had moved to after leaving the Siegel estate, I told him I was not leaving. He said he knew. I said, don't be smug about it. He said, I'm not smug. I'm grateful. There's a difference. We have learned, in the year since, to say more of the things we were each, in our different ways, trained to hold. He tells me when he is carrying something before 8 months have passed. I tell him when my diligence is operating on anxiety rather than precision. We have developed, late and imperfectly, the specific vocabulary of two people who have been through something that required more trust than either of them had built the scaffolding for in advance, and who have decided to build the scaffolding now. Nadine Creason would understand this. Kimberly Creason would understand this. Laura Dawn would understand this. I think about this sometimes, the way certain kinds of survival produce a specific knowledge and earned clarity about what holds and what was only ever performing like something that would hold. My mother called me the week after the board session. She had seen something in the news, a minor item about a federal indictment connected to an Atlanta real estate firm, and she had called to ask if I was all right. I said I was. She said, your father always said you'd know when to move. I thought about the night in the study with the $9 million and the 12-minute banking call and the dawn arriving over Atlanta while I closed the laptop and lay down beside a man I didn't yet fully understand. I thought about what it means to be precise inside uncertainty, to act without complete information, to move because the cost of staying still is the one cost you cannot afford. I said, he was right. She said, he was often right. Don't tell him I said that. He had been dead for 4 years. We both knew what she meant by it. I do not tell this story as a triumph. I want to be clear about that. There is a version of this story that presents it as a clean victory. Woman outsmarts criminal patriarch, saves the company, keeps the husband, wins. That version is real in its facts and wrong in its texture. What it actually was is messier and colder and more instructive than a victory. What I learned is this. The people who build frames around you rely on the assumption that you are too invested in the picture to examine the frame. They use your own diligence as mortar. They use your trust as a tool. They are counting on the fact that the woman who built something real inside their structure will spend more energy protecting what she built than investigating what she built inside. They are not wrong about most people. They were wrong about me because I am my father's daughter, and my father taught me that every number has a home, and every home has a door, and if you hold the key, you hold the outcome. I held the key. I found the door. And by the time anyone thought to take it from me, I had already walked through. The end. From a midnight hallway on the 73rd floor to a federal indictment and an empty chair at the head of a board table. Irma Marley's story proves that the most dangerous person in any room is the one who has been underestimated long enough to become invisible. Ricky Siegel didn't lose because Irma was louder or stronger or more ruthless. He lost because he built his contingency plan around a woman he had watched be brilliant for 5 years and still somehow failed to take seriously. Bram Essel should have checked the IP records. Fenwick Bard should have stayed in Atlanta. And Ricky Siegel should have remembered that when you build your exit strategy around a person's name, that person gets to decide what their name does next. Hit subscribe for next week's story. A woman discovers on her wedding morning that the venue, the flowers, and the officiant were all booked under her name by a man who has been running the same scheme in 4 cities. What she does with the 2 hours before the ceremony will stop you completely. See you there. Real talk. When Aldous revealed he had been cooperating with federal investigators for 8 months without telling Irma, was that a betrayal or the greatest act of protection in this story? A. Betrayal. No circumstance justifies keeping that from your spouse for 8 months. B. Protection. He made an impossible call under impossible conditions, and he was right. C. Both. It was the right decision, and it was also a wound. And both things are true simultaneously. D. None of that matters, because Irma moved $9 million in 4 hours at 1 in the morning using nothing but legal authority and precision, and I need a moment. Drop your answer below. And tell us, have you ever been in a situation where someone protected you in a way you didn't find out about until later? Did knowing change how you felt about it? Also, Ricky Siegel used Irma's professionalism and her trust as the instruments of her own setup. Does that make the betrayal more calculated or just more efficient? Sound off in the comments. Because this story is ultimately about one thing: what happens when the person you positioned as your weakness turns out to be the only person in the room who actually understood the structure? What do you think?